Thank you very much, Brad. I'm tempted to ask you whether I can have that old IBM personal computer because it looks like it's from Star Wars, and that's the retro kind of thing that we like these days. I guess,
We can get you one on eBay.
Thanks. That's good. Thank you very much, both to the commissioner who's already left us, and to Brad. And I would like to first of all, I need to get this click device. I hope it's somewhere still.
This is the click device,
Very good.
otherwise known as the clicker.
Fantastic. The clicker. And it's not from Star Wars, it's quite real. And I would like to introduce you first to the experts and thinkers that we have on the panel here to discuss some of the things that we've just heard about, and perhaps a couple of others as well, which are even taking a step back and looking at some more fundamentals. Let me see whether this works. Yes, you've got the list of people there. There's on my left here, Constance Bommelaer, who's the Senior Director of Global Internet Policy at the Internet Society, which is an advocacy group that I think in one sentence is advocating to keep the internet free, to keep it open and free and accessible. And we want to hear from you what you think about some of these things and some of the privacy issues, but also other things, perhaps the role of the state in all of these things. But we'll come back to this in just about a second. Then we have Luciano Floridi, a professor in Oxford for philosophy, who is thinking about these kinds of things in very profound terms. He has launched and is advocating a philosophy of information, and he has made, among other things, the case that the humans, when they learned from Darwin that they were not really separate from animals, from the animal kingdom, they're now learning that as carriers of information, they're not really any different from any other thing carrying information. They're all part of the infosphere, the information sphere, and as such, information is really what defines them, perhaps more than anything else. And then the question is, how can that be protected, and what part of it can be protected? And then finally, Vincent Richardson, who is the Chief Information Officer of Concern Worldwide, but is also Concern Worldwide, by the way, is a humanitarian aid organization working specifically to alleviate very, very basic needs of the least developed countries, of the poorest people in the world, working primarily in the countries ranking the lowest in international development. But Vincent is also, and this is what makes him so valuable for our task here today, the chairman of an organization called NetHope, which is a network of NGOs and of tech firms who support it, that try to leverage technology and the progress in technology to help these people. First of all, to enable these organizations to do their work better, but then finally also to bring it down to those people who are in need. So we have a fantastic panel here, and I would like to ask Luciano first. Now that we've heard from Brad that the companies are on our side, they're our friends, they're defending us, but given also some of the other forces that we've heard about, is privacy in our day and age and in what's about to come, is it protectable at all? Can it be protected, or is that still some sort of illusion that we like to cling to and that others, including governments and companies, try to sell to us?
We start with an easy question. It is protectable, and that's the simple answer. It is even more protectable if the good guys, as we heard, get together. Normally, if you think for a moment of the word crime, and normally the word that you associate to crime is organized. Crime is always organized crime. Now think about good people, and the word that normally you associate to that is disorganized. They all go their own ways, they have different values, they bicker. So in a way, it's not surprising that we are having different minds about, say, privacy or other fundamental rights, because we are the good guys, and good guys disagree. Take philosophers, they constantly disagree. But they are meant to be on the good side of things. So I think that privacy and other fundamental rights are defensible. I would also add, if I may, that they're also in a more perhaps unstable state than we would like to think. I mean, fundamental rights, unfortunately, they develop. They develop with us, with our history, with our understanding, with our technology. Privacy, for example, is not just a matter anymore of individual privacy. It's also group privacy, something that even 50 years ago would have been inconceivable. But do groups, a family, a social group, an ethnic group, deserve to be respected in terms of their own identity and privacy, as well as John, Mary, and someone else? Probably. We need to have a debate, but that's just a more example of the protectability of rights as they develop, as well as our technologies.
The next question to you, and I think we need to do something about the microphones here, right? The next question to you is just a direct follow-up. Now, states and governments and companies and NGOs are all very concerned about privacy and some other of these issues that are looming large. But to what extent can privacy protect it against the stupidity of the people who reveal everything?
The sincere answer?
Yes.
There is no protection against stupidity. The only protection against stupidity is to make sure that when stupid action happen in a safe environment. You really want to crash their car against their wall? Make sure that their wall is really soft, because that person will drive as fast as he can possibly drive against their wall. It's just a softy wall, so you cannot do any damage. That's the only protection against stupidity.
Right. Is that an optimistic outlook or a negative?
we got plenty of technology to build softy walls. It's design. You design the technology in such a way that when you click on that thing, do you really want to reset your hard disk completely, losing all your data that you cherish so much? And you say, yes, yes, think twice, yes, yes. Well, think twice tomorrow. And then you say, oh, that's what I was doing. Oh, that was so silly. So design can actually help us to make sure that stupid actions, which are not always malicious, can have a limited effect. But bottom line, we are human beings. We are intelligent and stupid at the same time. So a foolproof against stupidity, well, that's utopia.
Thank you. Let me move to Vincent and move to another realm, just to open another can of worms. You're working in your day job, I guess, in this humanitarian organization that does development work, that does instant relief for people affected by severe hardship. You're working in parts of the world where technology isn't even available. Now, I've looked at the World Bank report that was published yesterday on digital dividends, where the World Bank was assessing to what extent the digital revolution was actually benefiting people around the world. And the World Bank said that, yes, there is obviously a great benefit there, but 60% of the people in the world are still offline. Digital dividends are being rolled out too slowly, not fast enough for everybody to catch on. And they're saying that with all of those chances of more innovation and more joining the economy, there's also severe risks of control, of exclusion instead of inclusion, and of the gap actually widening. From your experience in the humanitarian sector, if you had to kind of weigh the positives against the negatives, what's your net assumption for is technology more of a risk or is it more of a benefit for your work?
Well, definitely a benefit. Absolutely. For organizations like Concern, of which there are many around the world, technology has been instrumental in how we approach the work we do, from how we present our message and our mission to the general public, how we raise funds, how we maintain our relationships with donors, to how we take that money and then distribute that in the areas where we serve. So technology is foundational across every aspect of our business. The most recent trend in technology in our space is the concept of technology in development, or ICT4D is the buzzword that's been around for quite a while. And it's how we can take the most appropriate technologies and have them penetrate right through how we work to the beneficiary, to ensure that their needs are being best served. It can be using mobile phones to distribute cash. It can be using data gathering tools to ensure that the information that we're gathering on how successful our programs are working is being analyzed effectively and correctly, so we can course correct and make adjustments to the program so it's even more successful. And actually then the final one I should mention is how we can use it to help educate people. Where you're working in countries, well, as I say, that can barely sustain life, some very austere places where human capacities from an educational perspective are very low levels of literacy, let alone digital literacy. How can you implement technology in certain cases when there aren't pens or pencils and paper to help with education? So you have to find that right balance. How we approach our work, we look at countries that are underdeveloped. We look at countries that are developing. We're also now looking at countries that we would classify as fragile. And we're looking at countries that are in emergencies. So it's very nuanced. So you have to have a very clear understanding of all the various aspects and the dynamic in these countries so you can apply things most appropriately.
Let me talk briefly about the nature of things in your sector as well, Vincent. You said, and we heard from Brett rather earlier, that there's no such thing as national security any longer without cybersecurity. But that also means that companies, who are 80% of the players in cybersecurity, are now more crucial to security and to development and to all of these issues than before. Companies, corporate sector, private sector, not state players. To what extent do you rely on the private sector as opposed to state players, just to find out, whether we are weighting this in a right way, or whether we are just, are not really mentally prepared yet for the fact that, the private sector, corporate sector is so much more important for security and the development which you are concerned about?
The world in which we live is, as a concern, we're dealing with countries ranging from, as I said, countries that are, that are war zones. Syria, what's happening in the Lebanon and Jordan, refugees migrating through Europe, and all that's born from that. We're also dealing with countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are beginning to evolve some very detailed and comprehensive data protection policies in their own rights for their for their citizens. So not only does an organization like Concern have to look at the EU and American data protection, we're also now having to learn and understand data protection principles and policies from multiple countries across the world, particularly in the developing world. Now, where companies can come in, companies like Microsoft, I think NGOs cannot do this alone. The work that we've been doing over the years, we clearly look to work closely with the private sector as much as possible, not just for the lovely funding they route to us, but also for their ideas and capacity and thought leadership and all the research that they bring with them. It's quite interesting. Only this year, or last year, 2015, we had to write a distinct social media policy for our staff who work in emergency situations. That was a first thing. That was a first for us. Now we would have, social media policies and how we engage with social media for our staff who are involved in advocacy and so on. But we're having staff now who are working in some very, very dangerous places. And, there are actors in that sphere who are using the cyberspace as a tool on their belt for terror. So we are able to respond to that.
Right. Thank you very much. Constance, Brett told us earlier that he went to the White House to see the President Obama, to ask the US government to create the kind of framework conditions under which American companies would still be attractive for people outside America, so that they can regain the trust that was perhaps partially lost. If you were to go to the White House and talk to this president or the next president, whoever that might be, what would you ask, coming from the internet must stay free kind of position that is really very much yours?
Yes, absolutely. I think definitely we insisted. There was a lot of discussion about the importance of trust. And indeed, if we want the benefits of the internet economy, we need this trust to be restored. The importance of the communications and the commerce between the US, North America, and Europe imposes that we restore this trust as soon as possible. The negotiations, the discussions around the Safe Harbor Act are definitely very important. And at the Internet Society, through our European Regional Bureau, we will be supporting and contributing to the discussion as possible. One important factor, I think, for the US to consider is the nature of the European privacy, our conception here in Europe of what private data is, what constitutes the very fundamental nature, the human rights nature within privacy and private data. I wanted to, which is quite different from the U.S. conception. I wanted to bounce, perhaps, if it's possible, on the necessity to have discussions between the private entities and also governments and IGOs. We've seen that the very nature of internet issues, where the technology and policy elements are intertwined, also means that mechanisms, public policy mechanisms and discussions have to be organized a little differently. I'll take two concrete examples. You said that the Internet Society is an advocacy group. Actually, through our history, we are more of a technical body, because the Internet Society was created by Vincent over 20 years ago, and we are the umbrella organization of the main standards body, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Through the Internet Engineering Task Force, but through other standards bodies, you have critical discussions and decisions that are made on standards that will affect the way the technology is used by people. This is why we need governments to be aware of these processes, we need users to be aware, and we need them to contribute and participate. Now, in a parallel way, we've seen, for instance, in the UN context, that intergovernmental processes are also evolving. I'll take one example. There's a body called the Internet Governance Forum. It's under the UN banner. All the members of what we call the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group are appointed by the UN Secretary General, but they represent all the different stakeholders of the internet community: business, the technical community, civil society. And they work on best practices, and they work on policy options, and they try to come up with useful, tangible solutions for emerging policy issues. And this is very innovative. I read a report from the US State Department 2 years ago predicting that civil society might have a voting right in the UN in 10 years. So this is also to say that we need to encourage these evolutions for more inclusive, more open, what we call multi-stakeholder governance frameworks.
I would like to ask exactly on this one. You know, this is what we hear now on the panel: multi-stakeholder, multilateral. You know, governments working with corporations, corporations working with NGOs, and so on and so forth. This sounds like a huge love fest. Everybody sits around the table. You know, there's understanding, and there's acceptance of the other person's kind of position. Is this really the case? Is this the nature of the beast? Is this how we're discussing this, or is there actually a lot more antagonism in there than kind of comes out of this here today?
So around, you're the academic and the thinker here, but around the concept of multi-stakeholder governance, I think it's important to understand that there are different possibilities. There can be multi-stakeholder processes with equal decision-making on an equal footing. There can be multi-stakeholder processes where stakeholders are consulted, and then the UN or governments or various intergovernmental organizations make their own decisions. In the OECD context, we are consulted, but the OECD makes its own recommendations. This said, when intergovernmental organizations and governments start affirming and asserting that multi-stakeholder processes are good and important, they look good if they manage to reach consensus. And consensus is very difficult, on the contrary of a voting procedure. Even what we call rough consensus in the technical environment, if you go through an IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, discussion session around the development of a standard, they have a habit in that context. When they reach consensus, they start humming, all of them. It's a culture. But before reaching that stage, the debate will be very, very intense, because you need consensus. 1, 2, 3 individuals carrying a lot of weight can stop the process. It's much more difficult than voting. So yes, I would say that You see rough discussions through rough consensus procedures.
In the development of the internet and keeping it free as is the cause that you are fighting for, do you see that, by and large, this is on the right track, given all of those mechanisms that you've described? Or is it on the wrong track in that, yes, we're doing all of this, but in the end, there's still the temptation to regulate it to speed and all of these kinds of things that would, impede the freedom of the internet? Where do we stand roughly? Is it like a 50%, an 80%, or a 10% situation we're in?
I think from my perspective, it is rather on the right track because we see the public's awareness that is very important today. People are watching us. My parents finally understand what I'm doing for a living. At the same time, the scale of the issues and the negative impacts is more important. So I would also say that at the same time, it can be more frightening.
Brett, I would like to come back to you as well. The ultimate authority that a company like yours listens to is the customer. And the customer in Europe is a bit different than the customer in the United States. Perhaps a little more skeptical about technological process, where the cliche has it that Americans love progress and will embrace it very quickly, early adopters, whereas the Europeans are often a bit late in the game, more skeptical and a bit more fearsome. And this is about a fear, I guess, my question. Europeans take the mobile phone and access to all kinds of online services for granted, but they've also learned, through the Paris attacks that you've mentioned, through the Snowden affair, NSA, and also through the refugee crisis, where technology played a huge facilitating role for refugees to come here, that, there are huge disruptive powers that they're actually fearful of. How do you approach the cultural divide, the fear level divide? And if you want to regain trust, how do you address those fears as a company?
It's a great question, and I often start with the mission statement for our company, which is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. And I often find myself in places like Washington, D.C., reminding American policymakers that only 4.5% of the world's population lives in the United States. Now, a higher percentage of the world's population lives in the European Union, and a higher percentage of the world's population still lives outside of both the United States and the European Union. So just as we're operating in a multi-stakeholder environment, and I think that raises a very good point, we're also operating in a multicultural world. There are some values that people might say are universal and timeless, but there are different needs and concerns on people's minds. And this too is part of the balance we need to strike. Because the internet is global, I do think things like standards can be global. They can cut across borders. They can connect the globe. Organizations like the IETF, for example, I think that's a great example of an organization that is able to work effectively on a global basis. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's inappropriate for communities and countries, or even continents, to want technology companies to understand their local needs and values. And we need to keep both in balance. And at the end of the day, we can't advance trust if we sacrifice accountability. That means that companies need to be accountable to the law, and that companies need to be accountable to regulators. So we need a level of local accountability, and we need to recognize that laws at times will vary. But we hope that with more dialogue, frankly, we can get more harmonization than divergence in regulatory and legal systems, and that can promote a global network and global technology, even while staying true to local needs.
I would like to break that down a bit further, a bit more concrete perhaps, and by making a personalized kind of story that you can always prove everything, the one thing and exactly the opposite as well. But I would like to ask you what you would say to a friend of mine back in Germany, maybe his name is Marcus, and he hears the name of your company and kind of his eyes glaze over. this is the kind of company, I buy their product, automatically I'm connected to some kind of great kind of, storage data kind of stealing mechanism that sucks it all up and puts it somewhere and I don't have control over it. For him, all of the arguments that you've made about you are in control of your data, you can, if you are actually smart about how to do it, you can control of that. For them, that's not the point. For him, there's an automatism. There's an automatism of distrust, an automatism of, oh my God, these guys are after me. You can't really, convince him what you've just said. You need to get him differently. He is reliant on his data processing capacity. He needs it every day, but he is not convinced that you or any of the other major companies that were on your chart earlier is really serving him. How do you get him back?
Well, I actually think that anecdote speaks to part of why we launched this data trustee model in Germany first. It's why we're saying, look, we understand that there may be customers, there may be companies, there may be governments that are not going to be comfortable entrusting their data with us. And if that's the case, we can and will find ways to advance our technology while enabling customers to entrust their data with someone else. And we would also add that there are other alternatives. There's companies can build their own cloud, they can have their own server room, people can store their data locally, they don't have to put it into the cloud. They sacrifice certain efficiencies or even features if they do that. But I think it's incumbent upon us, if we're going to be successful, frankly, to appreciate that different people do think differently. And we can't expect everybody to adapt to us. We have to be prepared to adapt to the differing needs of customers around the world.
I want to move on to Professor Floridi because he has made a couple of very bold statements which are perhaps philosophical in nature, and I described one of them earlier, that we are in an infosphere where humans are not really separable from any other carriers of information. Now that sounds rather abstract and very general and very bold, but what does it mean for humans in general, with all of this progress happening around us, the rapid integration, the enormous amount of data, almost uncontrollable kind of amounts of modernism blasting into our daily lives? How will human nature, just to give you like 2 or 3 minutes of the philosophy behind of this, how will it change? Will humans be able to kind of preserve humanity in the way that they used to, or are we moving towards something that is so fundamentally different, that is hard to imagine at the moment, perhaps except for the philosopher?
Okay, let me first make sure that we're not doing too much philosophy. When I was young, I was very disappointed when I was told that essentially I was 90% water, 95, 85. Basically the difference between me and a jar of Nescafe was nothing. I mean, I really did. And I just thought, no, it's me. I mean, I can't be 90% of water. Surely I'm much more than, so much these days, more than 80 kilos of water, 80 liters. And why that example? Because we all understand, oh yeah, of course, chemistry, that's what it says. That's one way of conceptualizing an individual, chemical. And you think, in terms of water and a little bit of extra, not much. Then you take Newton and we conceptualize ourselves for quite a while. It helps that it overlaps with Westphalia, for those of you who do those kind of things, the my place, my rules, your place, your rules kind of idea. We conceptualize the human being, the individual, as a mechanism. Push and pull, energy, entropy, and it all was very fine. It was very 19th century kind of ideas. I mean, today, when I say those bold things like, informational organisms, I'm not saying, and no one who believes that should be saying that, all you are is a bunch of information. Of course not. But you are a diamond, and there are many facets to that diamond. One is a lot of water, the other one, a Newtonian mechanism, and the one that we privilege today is informational. So when kids come to school and says, what did you learn from school? I say, DNA. What's DNA? don't know, kind of software. So, okay, well, that's the perspective you're having on DNA. And when you talk about communication, almost nobody thinks in terms of telegraph and vinyl. There's all digits going up and down. You speak about music, and the first thing you can ask is, say, oh, how many gigabyte of music you have? And of course, that's not about the only way you can talk about music and so on. But we have acquired these days, thanks to Turing and other agents, including Microsoft and so on, we have acquired this perspective, which is adding to the complex vision of a human being, of personal identity. Now, that is the premise. So, relax, everybody. It is not insane philosophy. Oh, you say that we are just information. Of course not. But there is that facet that we're looking at, we're focusing on. And with that focus, of course, privacy, trust, relationships, safety, they become immediately a defining issue of our age. If who I am today is defined in terms of information, Alan Turing way rather than Isaac Newton way, two Cambridge people, what can I say? Well, the point is that privacy becomes immediately something that affects me as a bundle of information. Now, this is a difference between two different philosophies across the Atlantic. In one case, it's a difference, it's not a contrast. It's not something that is irreconcilable. It's just two ways, again, of looking at something crucial. In one case, you look at all these informational organisms, and what's the best way of making work with each other? Through privacy. So privacy becomes a social way of facilitating social interactions. United States, and I'm oversimplifying. Europe, you still have that informational view of an individual, and what is privacy? Oh, is what defines you, is your special identity, is the only you that you don't want to touch too closely unless you allow me to do that. Is the shared secret you have with your best friend, is the communal identity that you have in Shakespeare. Now, a marriage of two minds, and so on. So again, it's a particular way of understanding the individual. Now, social grease, as it were, or personal identity, they don't have to be incompatible, but we need to sit down to make sure that these are components of a bigger picture. And that's the task in front of us.
Thank you. I would like to go back to Constance briefly, real quick, because we were talking very briefly beforehand about human rights. And you made a very interesting point. You said that roughly the development of the internet and the development of the way in which we talk about human rights and how they're being, discussed have great similarities. Now, I would like to ask you to elaborate on that for just a very quick second, and then perhaps draw a conclusion from that. What does that mean for the way we handle the internet?
Right. Well, I mean, obviously the inventors of the internet did not think about human rights, or advancing human rights was not their primary preoccupation when they invented the internet. But we've seen that the fundamental architecture of the internet, the way it was designed, is very similar to the universal nature of human rights. The internet, on the contrary of the broadcasting technology, for instance, is based on the principle of end-to-end. In theory, anybody can send information through the internet to any other point without any kind of authorization. This allows permissionless innovation. When people want to add blocks of innovation through the internet, using the internet, they don't need to ask for permission. The fact that the internet, which is a collection of networks, is a unified space today, still is today, also means that unless we balkanize, fragment the internet, free flow of information, the information can evolve and circulate at ease in this unified space. So this has led, and this is my conclusion, this has led at the UN. We saw that the World Summit on Information Society held its 10-year review. And you'll remember that 10 years ago, people were talking about the technical governance of the internet. And what happened in New York 3 weeks ago, fundamentally the discussion was about what are the timeless principles that should be the pillars of the future of the information society. And then technical governance, and then how do we organize cybersecurity, that will unfold of these principles we agree on. let me just finish by saying that it also shows that there's an interdependence between the principles that govern the internet. We have human rights, but we also have an open internet. We've just talked about the importance of having a unified space. And for all this to remain lively, it needs to be nurtured by multi-stakeholder governance. We need users to be aware of their rights, that we need them to get involved in the way standards are developed and the way policy options are considered. I think this is very important, the fact that these different principles need to be interoperable.
And strangely enough, it's those countries that don't have a stellar human rights record who are quite interested in fracturing, the internet and making and creating little sub-islands that are not open to the other sides, right? I mean, that's the interesting phenomenon that, those who have a bad record on the one hand also have a pretty bad record on the other.
I think on this front, the importance for organizations like the Internet Society and any other advocacy organization or even corporations and civil society activists who are interested and who care about human rights and how they need to be promoted through internet technology. For me, the key is really demonstrating that if you keep the internet open, you will have more economic benefits. It's important to have a message around human rights, but if you tie the economic component, chances to convince a certain number of countries will be higher.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I would like to get one or two questions perhaps in. I can see already fingers going up. Perhaps one from this side. It's this gentleman in the second row, and against the light, perhaps there's another hand going up here. That I see one down there in the back. Perhaps you first. Please introduce yourself and make that a very short question. One question only, please.
Thank you. Lukas Ilves from the Estonian government. To pick up on something you just asked, isn't there a conflict between, on the one hand, respecting everyone's jurisdictions, as Brad Smith said, but on the other hand, actually protecting our values? Isn't at some point, from the perspective of our values, perhaps desirable to have something along either universal jurisdiction or to maintain some of the current extra jurisdictional or extraterritorial jurisdiction we have with just maybe a little bit more of a European flavor and less of a US flavor, but really to keep the regime the way it is and not have 150 fractured jurisdictions with very poor human rights records?
All right, thank you very much. The next question is down here. Please also introduce yourself and only one question, please. Microphone's coming. Please wave so that the lady can see you.
Yes, hello, I'm Martin Schmelzried from the Confederation of Family Organizations. My question is about how do you deal with privacy and the proportionality about privacy? As you know, nowadays there's much business models developing around the use of private data, whether it's to target advertising more accurately or to analyze this data to make your business run more smoothly. So it's in a way, it's consumers paying with another form of currency in a way, creating value for companies, but with something else than dollars. And I was just wondering, when you go to a store and you compare a bottle of milk that costs $100 and one that costs $1, well, you probably know the $100 one is a ripoff. But in privacy and in the amount of data you share versus the service that you receive for free, quote unquote, you really are kind of lost as to the equilibrium here. Am I providing too much data for the service I received? Is it too much exploited compared to the service I received? So how do you actually manage that? How, in transparency, we're talking about transparency. How are you being transparent in telling consumers, well, you're actually providing the right amount of data for the service you're getting, and it's fair in a way?
All right, thank you very much. Then there's a third question and the last one over here in the third row. The finger is up.
Sinan Ülgen with Carnegie Europe. I have a question to you, Microsoft President Brad Smith. The latest investment in Germany with your data centers and so on, a criticism of that may be that for the less liberal regimes, Microsoft is bowing to pressure about setting up data centers in other places. You are also, many of the companies are also against requirements for data localization, but this comes very close to this, to that Microsoft agreed to a step that smells like data localization. What would you say to that?
All right, Brett, why don't you take this one first? Sure. And then with the other two, which I think are a bit less specific and slightly broader, we go to the rest of
of the podium, please.
I think I would say three things. First, look, we're not an advocate of data localization obligations. In other words, laws that would require that data be stored locally. We do think that in many ways there's just enormous benefits for people to being able to store their data in different places. And frankly, if the world were to progress too quickly towards requiring data storage in every country, not only would you put at risk the freedom of information to move around, but you would undermine the basic economic vitality of, frankly, creating such low-cost alternatives. So we share the concern that you described. Second, I would say, having said that, there are a number of governments around the world that do require that certain categories of data be stored locally. Most typically it's for public sector data. And what we are encouraging is more focus on what people are calling data classification. Let's try to help people get more sophisticated. What kinds of data are they more comfortable with seeing stored elsewhere? What kinds of data would they want to see stored locally? But it is a reality in the world today. Third, at the end of the day, it is our job to serve our customers. And if you want to store your data on the PC in your house, we are here to make that possible. We may think it's not the best choice for you. We would tell you that if you store your data on OneDrive in the cloud, that if somebody steals your PC, you'll still have your data. If your hard drive fails, you'll still have your data. But we do recognize it's your decision to make. And similarly, if you want to keep your data in your server room, if NetHope wants to store its data in its server room, we might say, gee, I think we can offer more security in our data center, and I'll bet we can offer a lower cost. But we do respect that it is their decision to make. And if there's customers in Europe that really want their data in that data center in Germany, we will serve their needs. So we're trying to strike a balance. We're trying to be clear in what we think will work best, but I don't think it's necessarily our place to make everybody in the world do things the way we think would work best for them.
Vincent?
Yeah, I was just going to touch on the question that came from over there with regards to the consumerism of data and some issues around that. Now this is just personally my own opinion, but I think still at a consumer level there's a real lack of understanding when you hitch your wagon to a particular technology company who may or may not have any or all of your data. And we're here with Microsoft, and with reference to your friend and his issue as well, Google or Facebook, but we look at Google for a moment. Google is in essence, it's a data aggregator and a marketing company. When you're using a Google service or you're using Facebook, you're the product. I don't think most people realize that. Certainly not your average consumer who's going out to buy a €100 cell phone, smartphone, and use email and use Facebook. And I really think that, when it comes to privacy and the understanding of where your data is stored and who and how that may be accessed, I think people need to understand, the various services that they're taking on as sweeteners in their personal life before they start, as I say, putting everything up there into the cloud. And until, there's a broad understanding out there, and I do think that, organizations within the EU, perhaps the internet.org and so on, maybe have a responsibility to actually ensure that these perceptions are out there and that they're understood.
Thank you very much. Constance, I think you wanted to make a comment on one of these as well.
Was I?
Well, you're not.
No. I'm happy to add to what was just said. I think what is positive definitely is that the level of awareness has raised. Certainly, What's also interesting to see is with the development of new technologies in the field of identity management, that users, although they cannot understand all the technical aspects, legal aspects of a technology, can also refer in certain markets to trusted parties, third parties. And we're seeing a new market of actors emerging. I think this was already said, but definitely information of users will be absolutely key, and competition. The possibility of switching to another service or another trusted third party if users have concerns. And organizations like the Internet Society, but many others, are there to work with users on trying to address those concerns.
Competition and the maturity of the customer. We have Professor Floridi still final words, but also perhaps explicitly on the question of universal jurisdiction, if that's something that tempts you.
Then just about that. Internet, cyberspace, infosphere, whatever we want to call it, the on-life existence that we are increasingly enjoying these days, at least in Europe and in the US, they're not geographical spaces. We all know that. So the old solutions will not work, no matter how much we twist them. Therefore, we need to adapt those new issues to a new space. Now, there is hope, because we've been there before, somehow. We've been there before a long time ago. There was a space on this planet which was nobody's land, and it was the open sea. At some point, we fought, and we fought badly, especially in Europe, for the domination of that sea. And today, we don't have an issue. We have infringements, but those are clear infringements, and I won't mention who is infringing what these days. But the open sea is quite clear what is right and what's wrong. So there is a chance to solve that particular issue, and I would like to end with this particular comment. There is no human problem that cannot be solved by human intelligence. We just need to persist, and that is the rule.
Wow, that's a fantastic upbeat note at the end of this diorama, really, of issues. This panel was, of course, not meant to exhaust all of the philosophical or regulatory or political questions attached to it, but rather to offer you a glimpse into, how diverse and how multifaceted the issue really is. I have now the honor to invite you over to the coffee break. I hope the click thing clicked well so that we get the invitation on the screen as well. The coffee break will be served upstairs afterwards, and this is important for you. We have 2 breakout sessions immediately after the coffee break. One is in this room, and that will be about a study that Carnegie Europe has just published by Sinan Ilgen, the gentleman who had the 3rd question just here, about the overlap in regulatory approaches to the cyber world between the United States and Europe. And the second breakout session will be upstairs, 1 floor up, and that will be the launch of the Forrester study that was done for Microsoft on socioeconomic implications of the Internet of Things. So 2 interesting, very different, but very interesting and much related issues to talk about today. Those breakout sessions will happen after the coffee break, and after that we bind it all together in the concluding panel that would follow in the end of this conference. Thank you very much for your patience, but thanks specifically for the panelists and their interesting and instructive words. Thanks a lot for traveling to Brussels for this. Please give me a hand and thank the panelists for their contribution.
Thank you.